Like I should have been like two middle fingers up and just done it.
Welcome to Teaching While Queer, where we are providing queer folks working in education with a community to feel less alone and unload the burden of identity politics so you can work and live as your authentic self. I'm your host, Brian Stanton. My pronouns are he, they. I am a theater pedagogue and educator in New York City, and I am so pleased to have you here. Please enjoy Teaching While Queer. Through our conversation today, you will gain insights into the challenges and triumphs of coming out later in life. Discover practical strategies for being an authentic LGBTQ+ ally and educator, and learn how to support students and colleagues while navigating policies and personal growth in a professional environment. Tyler, how are you doing today?
Well, I am doing great. My name is Tyler Murphy. I am a teacher. I've been teaching now for, oh God, it's a long time. Let me think this through. For 30 plus years, and I teach all sorts of sciences. I'm the coordinator for science in our building, and I teach in let's just call it a conservative school district in suburban Pennsylvania. I'm the G in the LGBT. That's
Love that. I'm the G.
I'm kind of an old G, a not so old, but whatever. We'll get to it.
Uh,
Yeah.
what, what was
So as a queer student, I grew up in Christian school. And so if any listener understands what Christian school was like in the 80s, and so the 80s was that time when we only had cassette decks and things like that. But growing up in Christian school in the 80s, there was no room to be queer. There was no alphabet that you could belong to. There was only what people told you that you could be. And so the little queer boy that was inside of me had to stay camouflaged for the majority of my life. Growing up as a queer kid, humor became a huge thing for me. It was an easy way to deflect. You could be everybody's friend, right? You could be that annoying person. You would have slightly, especially at Christian school, you would have that little bit of like inappropriate humor that people would want to hear a joke about. And so you got that going for you. I wasn't overly athletic. I was chubby. It was all those things to try to keep people on the outside from me so that they didn't really know. Because for the longest time, I was just kind of wrestling with all of it. Always the friend, but never the boyfriend,
Yeah, that
right?
makes sense.
When you're unrequited, you're just trying to figure out who you are. So as a queer kid, I would say that, and I was in Christian school from second grade through 12th grade because my parents wanted to save me from the evils of public school, just to be clear. Full circle public school teacher, gotta love that. And then I went on to Christian college after that. So I doubled down on it and made sure that, let's just say, by the time I entered college, my closet was very well made. Cozy. Yeah, I think it had to be in order for me to stay in it for as long as I did.
I really love that you use the word camouflage because I think about it from a military standpoint that camouflage is used to keep yourself hidden but also keep yourself safe in times of
Right.
combat. And when you're a young person and you are closeted, oftentimes any kind of social situation feels like a place of combat.
Right.
And you were talking about using humor to kind of deflect. And
Yeah.
I've been kind of reflecting on my life, wondering whether or not some of my outgoing characteristics were a ploy to kind of make people like me enough that they didn't question it, you know?
If they did question it, it was like a minor question, right? You were like someone that was on TV, so it was moderately acceptable.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what's funny is it's like I look at things that I did, and some of it is me, and some of it is like my family. When I was very, very young, my cousin and I were 3 months apart. We used to compete in like children's beauty pageants and stuff. And
Wow.
so there are things that I have done that are like overtly queer. I was a theater kid, I was a band kid, I
Right.
was a choir kid. Like I did all the stereotypical things. but I also played baseball and I was very outgoing and I loved Power Rangers and I used to play fight all the time, you know?
Sure.
And so it's like I look back and go, I wonder what was actually me and what was
Mhm.
me masking.
Such a good point. So, fun fact again, I didn't come out till I was 51. So let that
Oh,
mic
wow.
drop for a second there. Right. Very baby gay right here. I've only been out for about 3.5 years now and have been married and I have two kids. So when I say my closet was comfortable, like I made sure that that thing was taken care of. But one of the things that you were saying about in terms of masking is I think that we more so than I think kids do today, is that we had to find ways that we could fit in and carve our niche without really standing out. So it was either humor or, like my partners would be, it was intelligence. And so if it was theater, you had your own family in theater, right? Theater kids are their own kids. They always have been. Or you have band as a family. But if you're in the general population, Gen Pop, we'll use a good prison analogy for school. And just to be clear, I had 20 kids in my graduating class. I
Wow.
was with those kids from most of them knew me from second grade through 12th grade. So we were kind of a weird dysfunctional family. And I was just the Charles Nelson Riley of the class kind of thing. I don't even know how else to like go for that, but we'll just use it. I would definitely say that we had to figure a way to fit in. And it's amazing when I look at my kids today who are so much braver than I was. And are willing to just stand out in themselves, right? There, if you were to ask them what it was like to be a queer kid, they would still say they have struggles and they take heat from people and things like that, but they stand in who they are. And oh my God, I don't feel like I was standing for the longest time. So it's a weird juxtaposition to be a queer educator and have that perspective.
Absolutely. And one of the things that we were talking about beforehand was the question, what was life like for you as a queer student sometimes trips people up because of the closet. And I think one of the changes that we would see if I asked this question to someone who's younger now is that they have a queer student life, they have a
Yeah,
queer life now that they
right,
can relate to. Whereas many of us who are older, there's a kind of a wall of I was this person and then I came out. And
correct.
and so the fact that people are able to be themselves at a younger age is wonderful and kind of changes that dynamic, because I think that while I recognize all this queerness from my childhood and I was outed at 14, I've had a long time feel comfortable with myself. I have a lot of people that I talk to who don't see their life as queer until they were starting to think about their sexuality and coming out, because hiding
Right.
was so intense that you didn't think you were having queer moments because you were trying to avoid queer moments at all costs.
100%. And you bring up a good point. I think you had said earlier that when we come out, one of the things is we have to kind of decide what we're going to keep. That's us. And what was like put on. Either we put on ourselves or society puts on us as to what we. And I think today they don't have as many of those things, which is a beautiful thing. I have queer kids in the hallway who are just friends and they know that they're queer and they're out and they talk about their relationships and you're like, wow, like that's amazing. When you think about it. My daughters are 25 and 20 and so they constantly talk about how it was for them and friends of theirs and it was never an issue, right? And I'm like, man, I would say that if we were in high school in 1987, 88, it was the issue, right, to try to avoid. So it's really interesting to see that juxtaposition.
And I would double down on that and say that I went to high school in 1998 to 2002 and it was still an issue.
All right, thanks for making me feel really old there, but yes, to your
I
point, yes,
but
no,
just
no, you're good, Bri, you're good.
the the fact that it was so stigmatized, and part of that has to do with coming out of the 80s and early 90s with the AIDS epidemic and
Correct.
all of this negative publicity and rhetoric around gay men. specifically gay men. So it was a lot harder. I feel like the women in my life, the young women that I was in high school with, who there was like a gang of lesbians that I hung out with, and they were all like very comfortable with themselves. And
Hmm.
it was a lot easier in some aspects because they weren't surrounded by death just
Yep.
by, being named a gay man.
Right.
But I want to talk a little bit about your experiences in education and
Sure.
how like camouflaging and even coming out later in life.
So there, that's a big nut to crack right there. So as I said, I came out in, I guess, 21. So yeah, that was also the year that my school district put in a policy that took down all pride flags. It took down everything that could be considered political. Like that was the line that they went through. The board at the time was fully Republican, and they were very much concerned that we were going to be, teaching their kids gender theory and whatever buzzwords that they want to use. There's certain words I just am not even going to allow them to use anymore, so I'm not even going to say them, but we all know what they are. And so I come out during this time. Now, not out like ta-da, like velour and all. Like, yes, I'm not exactly right. It wasn't that. My partner makes fun of me because I'm such a, I don't know how he described it, but typical maybe was is too light a word. But like it was October, so of course I came out in October, right? Because it's coming out month. And so I planned this thing after my marriage had ended in the spring, and I started to kind of figure out who I was. I started to realize that this is what I was going to do. And so while I'm figuring all this ish about myself out, all this is going on at school at the same time. So as I'm becoming proud of who I am, the things that symbolize pride are coming down. So it was scary, and it was interesting because, like I said, Christian school experience, right? You're used to hiding. And here I am at this point where I'm like, I'm 50 some years old. I'm not hiding anymore. And then here I am feeling that same feeling again. Interestingly enough, I had students in class that were openly queer and were okay talking about it. As I teach science, so lab, I don't know if you've ever watched a lab group before, but all they do is talk. Like the lab takes 10 minutes, but the conversation takes 40, right? That's why I love science. You talk more. And so their conversations would be there, and I would just roam through and get to hear all of that. And sometimes I would add in and they would include me. And it was good for my mental health to see that there was these conversations. But all the while, I had to be very conscious that I wasn't leading anyone in a way that led to something, right? And then in December, I come out to my family. I'm out to everyone at work by January because I'm like dating and things like that. So I wanted to be as open as possible. And I know this gets to one of our questions about how do you be authentic at work. And one of the things was I was including people in what dating is like as a gay man. Now, like not all of it. Let's pump the brakes because I know some people are like, "What have I tuned into?" But that was especially someone in their 50s, right? That's a whole new experience. And so that next year, that was kind of like how things were. And then so here's where the rubber meets the road to our questions. So that year, within the next year, I meet my partner. By 22, I meet my partner. His name is Shane. And I fall for this guy, right? He may have fallen for me too. And so I have decided that I want to have a picture of him on my desk. But the policy says that only certain things are allowed, right? But family pictures are one of them. But I needed to ask because you got to be sure, right? You can't be caught up in this mess. It took 8 weeks for the district office to get back to me. And they got back to me with, well, of course you can have a family picture up. And I sent back a question because this is how my mind works now. And I sent back and I said, okay, but when people ask who that is, what am I permitted to say? Can we just hang that question in the air for a second? What am I permitted to say?
Isn't it ridiculous that we have to ask that?
Right. And like I was mad at myself for asking it. Like I should have been like two middle fingers up and just done it, right? But I wanted to do this the right. I didn't want to give them any footing. And so then I got like no answer back. And so I had to ask a building principal what to do. And the building principal let it be known she's an ally. And she said, family is family. So you do, if your family looks like this, then that's the picture that's there. And if people ask, you tell them who your family is. Right? Bawling, right? That's the kind of thing. And it was one of those things where you were like, still waiting. I waited 2 more weeks from district office, and they said, well, you should have, if you have conversations with kids, you should just be cognizant of what you say to them. What am I going to say exactly? Like they're so, and you know this, Brian, their assumption is that our life is defined by sex. And so that is it.
I'm Angela Kelly Robeck, host of the Empowered Principal Podcast, a part of the Education Podcast Network, just like the show you're listening to now. Shows on the network are individually owned, and opinions expressed may not reflect others. Find other education podcasts at edupodcastnetwork.com.
Yep, that's why I hate the term like homosexuality, because the word sex places people in this weird mind space, while they're also forgetting that heterosexuality exists.
Right. Right. And so when you said to me, what's it like being a queer teacher? My first year of coming out, I had to deal with losing all symbolism and then finding someone and then having to ask permission to do that. So I ran the gamut of emotions, let's just say, at the end of the next year. So Shane and I have been together now 2 years, right? And I proposed to him and shared that on Instagram right before my kids graduated high school. My classes, right? And I didn't tell them, nothing like that. Just did it that way. And the outpouring, like at graduation, the number of kids that were like coming up and saying all these things and things like that. And it was the greatest validation you could have hoped for because I was playing it correctly. And so from there, the cat was out of the bag. So I started the 23-24 year as open, and my students knew it. And so it was one of those things where they would talk to me. Suddenly someone would ask me like, hey, did you see Drag Race over the weekend? Like, that's funny, or they're like, hey, have you heard, October of 23, they're like, did you hear this new artist called Chappell Roan? Have you heard her? Like, these are the kinds of things that like Renee Rapp was all popular talk in the fall. And so it was one of those things where like now suddenly it's interesting to watch where I was so anxious about. And it just reminded me of the feelings I had back in high school and college and being anxious and then realizing that anyone that I've ever told has been more than accepting and wonderful. And so that's the story I end up telling kids when they ask me about coming out. It's like, it was a huge fear because it's a risk, right? It's a risk. You're trusting someone. So yes, being a queer educator is a constantly evolving process at the school in which I work.
What are some things that you would do if you're confronted with anti-queer behavior?
Oh, so at a union meeting, I wore a shirt that said something like, if you deny my existence, expect my resistance. And someone was talking about it back at their building or somewhere else. And it got reported that I wore this shirt. Now, I wore it under a sweatshirt at school because that would never have been allowed. Like you can't wear, that's a political statement, basically. So it got reported that had happened, and I had to have a meeting with people about me breaking this policy, right? And at first, I was going to be like this whimpering simp and be sorry. And I remember like sitting in bed with Shane talking to him about it and just feeling like I'm dealing with like fear and regret and this thing of like, are they not going to like me? Um, and then I'm like, then I'm angry and I'm like, why does anyone even care about a shirt that I wore after school? Like those are all things, right? So I decided that I was not going to be the simp. And I took photos of myself in the shirt. I did them. So I teach criminology, just so you know. So I did them like a lineup in our bedroom against a bare wall. So you should, I told Shane I wanted him to mark like height markers on the wall because I wanted it to look full out. And I did it with the shirt on and I looked like, like anyone in a lineup should never look good. So I made sure I didn't look good. I know it's hard to imagine. And then I did one with like the sweatshirt that I wore and where it was zipped to, right? And I did a series of them for this meeting. So we go to this meeting and they're like, well, they're trying to read the words on the shirt. And I'm like, this is what it says. Matter of factly. I'm like, in fact, here's what it looks like. And I slide my phone across the table and zoom in so they can see it, right? And I'm not a small man, so this shirt is big, right? They should be able to read the words. And so they read through it. I'm like, that's what it is. I said, but this is what I looked like during the day. And I swiped left, of course. And as I did, they could see that they couldn't see what was on the shirt. And I watched them swipe back and swipe again. And I sat back in my chair and I said, I broke no rule here. I said, I wore that. This is what I looked like before 3 o'clock, and this is what I looked like after 4 o'clock in the afternoon on my time. So where's the problem? And then they backpedaled. There was apologies. There were even tears at some point from people because I had laid out basically my experience and what it was like. Because I wanted them to know, and I want to give full credit to the people on the other side of the table because they all received it really well. And I know they were doing their job, right? We all have parts of our job we don't like. So I'm going to give them an ounce of grace on that one. But you sit there and you think to yourself, is this what I'm going to be dealing with for the rest of my life? And am I going to receive it and just be like, oh, or am I going to fight it? And clearly my decision was to fight. And so that's how, when I see it now, and maybe it's because I've been in the closet so long, or maybe it's because I've only been gay for so long, right? Like my partner will say that I'm such a baby gay, but maybe because I haven't been in the fight for so long that I feel like I have to make up for it. So I'm ultra sensitive to the situation. And I will defend myself or my kids. I had students this year who the Gay Straight Alliance didn't really want to participate in something. They didn't like the idea of being put on stage. There's a lot of trans kids in the group, and they deal with a lot of bullying at school. And so the admin was really kind of cajoling them into doing it. And like, this is a good thing. And I have to give them credit. They stood up and they were like, no. And then I went to the admin later and I said, don't make these kids do this. Like, they lead every day just by being them. Don't make them lead the way we think they should lead. So, yeah, I'm probably a pain in the neck, but not the neck.
Yeah, but I think it's necessary. I also think that that's one of the things where I've stepped in with admin in the past as well about wanting to push for something that the students weren't buying into. And it's like, if we're here to serve the students, we need to listen to the students.
Right.
And if they don't want to do this, we need to accept that they have autonomy and that they should not be forced to do something they don't want to do.
Right. And that goes for both. That's on both ways, right? Like there are times where maybe there are people who feel like the gay kids are the only, or the LGBTQ at school, the GSA at school is the only representation of queer at school. So they have more responsibility, but that's a lot to ask of anyone. some ninth and 10th grader that's just starting to figure themselves out and you want to like put that responsibility on them, that's a lot. Let them just have a time to be them, with other queer kids in a club for a little bit. And if they want to become something else, then let's let them do it. But you're right. It's just one of those things where I think we push sometimes a little too hard.
Absolutely. When it comes to showing up authentically at work, what
Mm.
advice would you give someone who is maybe worried about that?
So, as I said, I can't have, right, flags and things like that. So I decided I would be the flag, pun intended. And my kids know who I am. So I am trying to be able to show them this is what a gay man's life looks like. I'm not necessarily showing up with like nails painted or hair done, hair dyed. None of that, none of that. I'm too old for that, right? In my head, I'm too old for all that.
Girl.
I
No, 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 no.
I feel I'm too old for that. It's my Christian school upbringing. But I don't necessarily need the sign to say safe space, but I can make sure that every kid knows that it's safe because I'm not going to allow certain things to be said, and I'm also going to make sure that those kids that feel like they don't have a voice have a voice. So I've kind of decided within myself within the last, especially within the last year, that I was going to have to be just me and be able to talk about my life with Shane, raising kids. When Shane and I go away, I post pictures of our vacation. Kids ask about it. I love music, right? And so I am constantly trading off music with kids. I always have music playing when we do lab. I have all different types of titles on my playlist. So my Gays Be Gaying playlist always gets a request because there's like all kinds of things that kids want to listen to while they're working. Um, you can only hear so much Gaga after a while, and you're just like, all right, guys, can we switch it up? Can I hear some Noah Khan or something? Let's go. And Taylor's always at the top of their list. When I was in the closet and I was married, I would always share my life. I shared what it was like as a dad, my kids. I'm doing the same thing now because there's no difference.
There's
Yeah.
no difference.
That's correct. The only difference is my partner is a man now. That is the difference. My kids respect him. One of my kids lives with us, right? And so my students see me just as a walking, talking example of just a different choice of how I am living in terms of just how but my sharing part is not changing.
And
I
what's
don't know. It's
intriguing over the next couple of years is that you're going to start getting into students who only know you as who you are now. And
That's freaky.
yeah, and you've had students who have seen you married to a woman and seen you engaged to a man. And
Right.
so it'll be interesting to see if those relationships get stronger because watching
Oh, for
someone's
sure.
journey and being a part of
Yeah.
someone's journey, it helps connect you. So it'll be interesting, just going into this next couple of years where you are experiencing children who've only known you now.
Oh, 100%. It was funny that you say that, Brian, because at the end of last year, I had my juniors and seniors were like, so do we get to come to the wedding? And when I got married the first time back in 1992, I did have students at my wedding, right? Because again, that's just the way I live my life. And so I told them, I said, yeah, I said, I don't see why the wedding wouldn't be open. I said, but we are not paying for everyone at a reception. Like, let's be very clear about this. Your ticket only gets you so far. But they're here for that and they like to hear the details of it. So it's really fun being that. I want to say one other thing. It's not just the kids though. The people that I work with, my school family, right? I think they would say that I am probably the best form of myself that I've ever been since. And they're like the greatest thing ever. I really lucked out with them.
fantastic. And it's good to hear, right? Being your authentic self really does make an impact on not only you, but the group around you gets to see. They get to see all this part of you that you weren't able to show.
Right. And, the stuff that's dropped off is stuff that you just didn't even need anymore.
You are enough, indeed. You've got quite a bit of educational policy working against you at the moment. And so
A
I'm
bit.
curious as to what you think the educational community can do to be more inclusive of queer people.
That's a tough one. The educational community, I know we had said like educational community. What does that ultimately mean? For many of us, it's school boards, right? And we have groups and factions that are constantly trying to, for lack of a better word, infiltrate school boards to put policies in place that limit people. If we're going to say as a county, as a district, as a state, right, as a nation, that we care about education, then we need to care about educating everybody. And if we're not looking at policies that do not treat everyone the same way, and we have policies that are like that, then we are not out to educate everyone.
Percent. I think about, the stay away from our kids group. And at the same time, I look at the violence against trans and queer kids, and I go, well, stay away from our kids. We're just
Right.
trying to make sure those kids survive. Why is it that you feel the need to persecute these children?
Right. Like, why do you have to step on the backs of somebody else's kid in order to make your kid feel safe? And as a parent of girls, I still don't get it. It's something that, I want you to know, like, we were completely taken over by that group at school. And our community, I don't know what kind of juice they drank, but there was a movement and they rebuffed and got them out. And they are now looking at trying to peel back some of these policies. So, if we were to talk again in a year, I could hopefully say that the stuff that we're saying is in existence now is no longer. And so I want to say that as much as we have times where there are groups that are trying to hold us back, then the pendulum swings. And so at my school, the pendulum is moving, and it may not always move as fast as we like it to, but it's moving. So I'm going to take that.
Absolutely. At this point, we have a question from one of our listeners. Today's question comes from Oscar, and Oscar asks, why education?
Wow. Okay. So I guess Oscar means, why am I even in education? Is that how you're taking it, Brian? Because that's how I'm taking it.
Like, why
Okay.
did you choose education? Why do you work in education?
I'm going to say education chose me. I was a physical therapy major when I went to college. I went to Messiah University in central Pennsylvania. It was only Messiah College then. I don't get too much credit for the university part. I was a physical therapy major, and I knew exactly what I was going to do. I think it was the fall of my sophomore year, my advisor, I was sitting in his office, and he slid a schedule over his giant desk to me. For younger listeners, they don't even understand the concept of like that your schedule was kind of like built for you to some degree. Like, I didn't have a lot of choice. I had a major minor running, and so my life had been planned for me, kind of situation, right? And he slid this over to me, and I looked at it, and there was this elective in the spring, and my course load, I could only have 2 electives for the entire 4 years that I was there, right? And so for one of them, he put in intro to education, and I looked at him, and his name is Dr. Noel Falk. He's probably one of the biggest influences in my life for teaching. And I looked at Noel and I said, "You've got to be kidding me. Like, what are you thinking here?" And he's like, "Tyler, we hear the comments that you make during lecture. Like, we hear you in class." And I'm like, there's part of me that like, oh, you hear me? Like, oh, that's kind of nice. And then at the other time, you're like, oh, they hear me. Like, there's that humor again. Like you're in a lecture hall of 300 people and your voice, your criticism is being heard. Oh, that's going to go over really well, right? So apparently the science department had a powwow and circled the wagons and decided that if I'm going to talk such a big game about what I think a teacher should be, I should actually do it. And so Noel was elected to because he was my advisor. And so I took intro to ed. I walked into that class and Dr. Stephen Hayes was in there. And Steve looked at me the first day and said, you're Tyler Murphy, right? And I'm like, do I have a badge on? Like what? And he's like, yeah, he's like, Noel told me about you. And I'm like, oh no, like that can't be good. It was the best thing I ever did. I took that class. It's a nice, easy elective, right? Like it wasn't something to be challenging about, but it really whet my appetite to the point where I went home and I had to tell my parents that I was changing my major. And my mother had already made up her mind that her son was going to be wearing like a white coat, right? And be like my son, the physical therapist. And I mean, I still wear a white coat just on lab days, but when I had to tell her I was switching to education, she was a little crestfallen because I think she thought the prestige and the money and all those things were not going to be there. And then I went and taught Christian school for 10 years, so I definitely had no money from that. But if Noel hadn't taken an interest in me, even though I might have been annoying, slightly annoying, and said to me, we see this in you, right? I would not be in education. It's his fault for everyone's sake. So to answer the question, why education, somebody thought that I would be good at this and they were right. And so when I have students, I typically try to encourage them, especially those that talk about going into school. And my first question is, are you sure? Right. And so we talk about things and then I always let them know matter of factly if I think they're going to excel in it. And because that's what he did for me. It was such a moving moment. Like I look back on it now and I'm like, man, he thought he was like the Godfather, right? With his plants and his taxidermy around him, but they're trying to paint you a good mental picture. But yeah, so education chose me and I have been all the better for it.
Thank you, Oscar, for your question. If you at home want to hear your question right on the podcast, you can click the Ask a Queer Educator link wherever you listen. Tyler, I just want to thank you so much for taking some time to talk with me. I really appreciate your story, appreciate how vulnerable you were. There was one moment of almost tearing up, so I really appreciate that you were so comfortable sharing that with everybody here.
Well, you're more than welcome. I remember seeing this pop up and I thought it's just something I have to do because there are people like me out there, right? Trying to figure out who they are. And they might be a lot younger, but we're all on that journey of trying to figure it out. And the more you can surround yourself with people who allow you to be you, then the richer you are for it. So
and today, you will gain insights into the challenges and triumphs of coming out later in life. Discover practical strategies for being an authentic LGBTQ+ ally and educator, and learn how to support students and colleagues while navigating policies and personal growth in a professional environment. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Teaching While Queer. Connect with fellow queer educators and your favorite guests on our online community at www.teachingwhilequeer.org. New community members receive a free resource focused on creating an inclusive classroom environment. Have a great day.